Don't be deceived by a mere 10-minute video. There's many hours' worth of footage and tons of progress in store. The first order of business was not directly related to the layout, but to the overall vibes of the Fratican. We recently remodeled our backyard, and so all the old hanging lights from out back are now repurposed in here to bring more lighting and a cozier ambiance. But after that, I made haste for the next most important upgrade: beans. Not just ordinary beans, black beans. I replaced the red beans used in the 97 coal elevator with black beans for a more coherent look. I won't say a realistic look because that's not really my end goal here. For goodness sake, they are dry beans. Next, it was time to actually do the scenery I promised last episode, which started with painting an undercoat for the hillside. I grabbed the can of paint from who knows how long ago when I repainted the table back in episode 1, gave it a hearty shake, only to quickly realize as I started painting that the texture was just not right. That poor can had gone through a brutal winter, which you can see more of in episode 3, and I think between all the temperature changes, it ended up weirdly congealed. I tried working with it because at first I didn't mind the rough texture. After all, it was going to be an undercoat for a geographical feature, but it was just impossible to work with and was ripping the plaster off when I brushed it on. So I settled for this little corner done. After a trip to Home Depot with Amelia to get a new can of paint, I resumed the process of painting the hillside. And what a relief it was to smoothly paint on the undercoat. Of course, Amelia was keen to help paint, and I thought, hey, if it's not on the walls inside our house, knock yourself out. The color is a bit vibrant, but I wanted it to be exactly the same as the table, so that it would actually look like a part of the overall landscape. After the paint dried, I could begin the process of laying down the track once again that had been out of place from the upper loop for ages now. I used some cotton balls to level out the bumpy surface underneath, and then covered it with some extra plaster cloth. And while the plaster cloth dried, I moved to another painting project. Applying the plaster cloth on the whole hillside meant that a lot of splatter landed on these Lionel tunnel portals, which I hand-painted this limestone effect myself years ago on the old layout. And so instead of trying to clean it off and risk rubbing off the old paint, I meticulously tried to match the pigments as best I could and began to tidy up the plastery mess. It really is amazing what just a little bit of touch-up can do to make it seem like the hillside was always there and that a tunnel was later bored through it. After the plaster cloth dried, I could apply the last bits of paint and touch up some other spots on the hillside. And while that paint dried, I moved on to the next stage of reinstalling the track in the upper loop. Since the hillside was lumpy and uneven underneath, I couldn't just slide track ties underneath the track without them falling into different positions and angles. So I had to glue them directly to the rails myself for this curve. Now, a little bit on how I do my track ties for my tubular track. I don't buy pre-made ties, but instead I go to the Hobby Lobby here in town, buy them out of their packs of wood strips that fit this track, of which they only ever keep a quantity of 2 packages in stock, cut them down to size, and then lay them out to spray paint, usually on old large champ scores from my work. I like the actual wood appearance and the grain that is visible. Plus, it's kind of a therapeutic process once you get in a rhythm of cutting them up. And it goes back to my sentiment of being creative with materials that aren't necessarily made specifically for model railroading. And it adds to the fun of literally building a railroad. And so with plenty of new ties, I continued gluing them to the track and was able to finish the curved section that would pass through the hillside. I very carefully laid it down, not pressing too hard anywhere for fear of breaking off ties. Secured the track back into place and ran some cars over to test for clearance. Then I ran my wee 080 switcher through the curve. Unsuccessfully. Multiple times. But I was able to tweak how the track was laid, and now it is resolved. Now, last time I showed ballasted track, I described the process that I used, but I didn't show it. And since this curved section passes through some geography, I'll need to ballast that portion. So, I take a small bit of my chicken grit here, spray paint it like so, stir it up, and repeat the process until the pink becomes a little darker and more subdued. And then the rest is just as you do with any other ballast. I poured it in the track, brushed it around, and then I secured it with the tried and true method of spraying the ballast with rubbing alcohol to break the surface tension, and then drowning it in a half-and-half mixture of glue and water. And after that, both myself and Amelia were delighted to be able to run trains on both loops again. Then it was time to at last lay some ground cover and bring some vegetation to this sterile wasteland. Amelia, having seen her mother shake many spice jars before, was eager to do likewise with my forbidden scenery spices. But we were interrupted by a new and very, very, very exciting arrival. My local train store had a big anniversary sale, which means that I was able to get a great deal on this beautiful 282 Gantry crane that they've had and I have been eyeing for some time. And you know the drill here. I hooked up a crude test, but was immediately alarmed to see that it was not working as I expected at first. Only for me to later discover that I was a moron and was using the controller wrong. The way the motor works inside the crane is ingenious, and while I can't describe it adequately, there's basically a clutch function that activates the hook instead of the cab rotation, which is activated by a simultaneous use of the controls. Once I figured that out, I was able to experiment with picking up some things with the electromagnet that hangs from the hook. And as you can see, I decided to place the crane over this portion of the lower loop instead of where it was on the siding, to more easily facilitate loading and unloading items between trains up top and down below. Plus, putting it here means space for another forthcoming siding accessory. I tried some other places, but ultimately settled on it next to the elevator. Now, since the wires were soldered to both the unit itself and the controller, it was time to do the deed and cut the massive cable to run it underneath the table. And yes, I did in fact neglect to mark the wires beforehand, which I would come to regret later. After some back-breaking puzzle solving under the table of which wire went to which, and yes, I did end up color-coding the wires then, I powered up the accessory and tested the crane with no issues. And we're back at the coal elevator for another important upgrade from beans: wheat. The beans just ended up looking like rodent turds on the table when they spilled during dumping and loading. Wheat is of course sentimental to me because I'm from Kansas, and it is a smaller grain and flows nicely from the dump car and elevator chute with minimum bouncing around. Now, you may have noticed the question mark in the video title after the word post-war, and it's because of this right here. This revolutionary way we play with trains is a system I in fact own. And while I was visiting my parents, I decided to bring it back up with me. Primarily because, yes, I want to get all my train stuff cleaned out for my parents' place, but I can actually control the ZWL transformer with the legacy system. Is it an excessive way to run post-war and conventional trains with a top-tier command control system that basically just turns the throttles for me on the transformer? Absolutely. But I'm also sensing a shift in how this layout will continue. The best way to describe it is to show this page out of the same old 2008 catalog. This layout here is very clearly full of tubular track and post-war accessories, but also includes modern pieces. I think my layout will take more of this shape, at heart vintage, but also moving with the hobby through its different periods. After all, this is an image that I literally grew up with perusing this catalog, and so it has some level of influence on how I want to build my layout. As a complete aside, it was also funny to just see some of these products for the legacy system advertised that literally never came to be. That full-on monitor screen here, for example. We'll pick up the conversation about the layout aesthetic later. For now, it's back to the forbidden spice jars. Now is the process of layering different colors and textures. The beginning is the worst part because it just looks so patchy and random. But just like a good oil painting, layers and layers and layers of color and texture come together to create a very convincing landscape. On vertical faces like this around the tunnel portals, I simply covered it with shrubbery because there's no good way to get ground cover on it. Sometimes I would spray it with high-hold hairspray and blow the ground cover on there from my hand, but it would never be enough to cover the surface. Then I used some coarse turf and some small bushes elsewhere to hide seams in the plaster cloth that were still visible. I might add some trees eventually, but very few if any. This hillside is inspired by the Flint Hills of Kansas, which are just these huge rolling green hills in the northeast part of the state. And so after all this ground cover goes on here, it's more or less done. And once everything was in place, it was time for a good dousing of glue. One might even sing the Asparagus May while I'm doing this. But with that, the majority of the hillside has a solid start for scenery. With the garage door open, the sunlight really brings it to life, even with the looming Kia Sedona hovering like the Death Star in the background. In any case, that's all the work for now. Thanks for watching. Still much more to come.